He hadn't been called that name in over 40 years. But when the woman across the street said it softly, like she wasn't even sure it stopped a billionaire dead in the middle of his perfect morning, the man froze with one hand still wrapped around his travel mug. Steam rose into the cool Connecticut air, curling between manicured hedges and freshly watered lawns. The kind of neighborhood where nothing unexpected ever happened, where people nodded politely, waved once, and kept moving. He didn't turn around at first. People didn't call him that anymore. Not neighbors, not employees, not the press, not even the charities that engraved his name on buildings and hospital wings. That name belonged to another life, a life he had buried. "Sir?" The voice came again, closer now. Careful, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry, you look exactly like someone I used to know." Slowly he turned. She stood at the edge of the sidewalk, holding a reusable grocery bag against her hip, keys looped around one finger. Late 60s maybe. Well kept, but not trying too hard. There was something steady about her, something unafraid. Though, searched his face like they were looking for permission to believe what they were saying. His chest tightened. For a split second, he saw her not as she was but as she might have been decades ago. Younger, brighter, standing in a different place. A different season of his life. "You're mistaken," he said quickly. Too quickly. The words came out sharper than he intended. Her smile faltered. Just a little. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, already stepping back. "It's silly. I must have—" "No," he interrupted, then stopped himself, his fingers tight and around the mug. "It's fine. People mistake me for someone else all the time." That wasn't true, but it was easier than the truth. She nodded, embarrassed now, the moment slipping away. Whatever she thought she had recognized already retreating behind good manners. "Well, have a good morning," she said. She turned to leave, and something in him panicked. "Wait." The word escaped before he could stop it. She paused. He stared at her back, at the quiet dignity in the way she stood there waiting. Not pushing, not demanding anything from him. "What was the name?" he asked. She turned slowly, surprised, studied his face again. "It was a long time ago," she said. "And I might still be wrong." "What was the name?" he repeated. Her voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "Daniel." The sound of it hit him harder than any headline ever had. For a moment, the world narrowed to the steady thump in his ears. To the memory of a man he used to be. To choices that had bought him everything except peace. He hadn't answered to that name since before the money. Before the empire. Before he learned how easy it was to leave things unfinished. She watched him now, not smiling anymore. Waiting. He should have corrected her, should have ended it cleanly. Instead, he said nothing. And that silence changed everything. "Before we go any further, let me gently ask you something. Have you ever run into someone who reminded you of a life you almost lived, or a love you never quite let go of? If so, you're exactly where you're meant to be." This is a golden heart story crafted for those who know that sometimes the heart waits longer than we expect. Tell me in the comments, do you believe love can still surprise us later in life? He walked home slower than usual. The mug in his hand had gone cold. But he didn't notice. His mind kept replaying the sound of that name in her voice. Not loud, not dramatic, just careful. As if she had known it carried weight. Daniel. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in decades. Not since the year he learned that reinvention could feel like erasure. Inside his house, the silence greeted him like an old accomplice. The door closed with a soft final click, sealing him back inside the life he had constructed so precisely. Marble floors, high ceilings, framed photographs of buildings he'd funded, hospitals he'd endowed, causes he'd supported. Proof of a life well lived, according to everyone else. He set the mug down and stood there staring at nothing. Why now? He told himself it meant nothing. A coincidence, a passing resemblance. That happens sometimes when you reached a certain age. Faces blurred, memory played tricks. And yet, he hadn't corrected her. He moved toward the study, where a wall of books rose behind an antique desk. Everything in the room was curated, chosen, controlled. He prided himself on that. But when he opened the bottom drawer, his hand hesitated. He hadn't planned to open it. He never did. But his fingers already knew what they were looking for. An old leather wallet, worn, cracked at the edges. Inside it was a photograph so faded it had nearly lost its color. A younger man, thinner, less certain, standing beside a woman with dark hair and a laugh that seemed to reach beyond the frame. He closed the drawer abruptly. Across town, she stood at her kitchen sink, staring out the window as if the street itself might explain what had just happened. Grace set the grocery bag on the counter but didn't unpack it. Milk warming, bread forgotten. She pressed her palm to the glass. That man had not looked like someone who was mistaken often. There was authority in the way he carried himself. A quiet gravity. The kind of presence that made people step aside without realizing why. And yet his eyes. She would know those eyes anywhere. She had known him once when he was restless and unsure. When his hands shook for different reasons. When he still believed he had time to become the person he wanted to be. Daniel had been kind in a way that scared her. Ambitious in a way that thrilled her. He had talked about building something bigger than himself. About leaving a mark. She had believed him. Grace exhaled slowly and turned away from the window. Don't be foolish, she told herself. People change. Men disappear. Names get buried. She had learned that the hard way. Her house bore the quiet evidence of a life interrupted but not undone. Framed family photos. A couch that sagged just enough to show it had been moved. A throw blanket folded with care. On the side table sat a picture of her late husband. Thomas, smiling, ordinary, safe. I'm not looking for trouble, she said aloud, as if he could hear her. I was just surprised. She busied herself unpacking groceries. But her mind drifted despite her best efforts. What if she was wrong? And what if she wasn't? Back in the estate, the man who no longer used his old name poured himself a second cup of coffee. Though it was already late morning, he didn't sit, he paced. He told himself he had survived worse than a moment of recognition. He had survived losing everything once before, starting over, becoming someone untouchable. But this felt different. This felt personal. He stopped in front of the mirror in the hallway and studied his reflection. The tailored jacket, the silver at his temples, the lines time had carved into his face. Would she still recognize the man he had been beneath all of this? Or worse, would she recognize what he had chosen not to be? His phone buzzed on the counter. A reminder for a board call, a life waiting to pull him back into its rhythm. He silenced it. Across town, Grace sat at her kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a cup she still hadn't drunk from. Her phone lay face down beside her. She didn't expect it to ring. She didn't want it to. And yet something inside her felt unsettled in a way she hadn't felt in years. Not lonely. Not sad. Awake. To people. To carefully contained lives. Neither of them ready to admit that the past had just knocked on the door. And neither aware that staying silent would soon cost them far more than speaking the truth ever could. If you're still here with me, take a breath. Because the next moment they share won't be accidental. It will be a choice. And choices, especially later in life, have a way of changing everything. They might have succeeded in avoiding each other, in a different town, in a different season of life, if fate had been less patient. But by midweek, The universe stopped being subtle. The community board meeting was supposed to be routine. A discussion about zoning changes near the old rail line. A proposal for a small public garden expansion. The kind of civic obligation people attended out of politeness more than passion. Grace almost didn't go. She stood in her bedroom that evening, cardigan draped over the chair, purse already on the bed, telling herself she was tired, that she'd already had enough surprises for 1 week. Then she thought of the garden, of the quiet pride she felt every Tuesday morning when her hands came back smelling like soil and basil, of the way being useful again had stitched something steady into her days. So she went. The meeting hall was modest, folding chairs, fluorescent lights, a low murmur of familiar voices. Grace signed her name at the entrance and took a seat near the aisle, nodding at a few neighbors she recognized. She didn't look toward the front right away. She didn't need to. She felt him before she saw him. The room shifted almost imperceptibly as a man took a seat to rows ahead. Conversation softened. Heads turned. Not dramatically, just enough to register presence. Grace's stomach tightened. When she finally lifted her eyes, there he was, not looking at her. His posture was composed, deliberate. Dark jacket, crisp collar. He looked like someone who belonged anywhere important decisions were being made. He looked like someone who didn't belong in a room with folding chairs. So I wasn't wrong, she thought. He sensed her gaze and turned. This time, he didn't look startled. He looked resigned. Their eyes met, and the space between them filled with everything they hadn't said on the sidewalk. Everything he'd carried home with him. Everything she'd tried to dismiss. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he inclined his head slightly. Not a greeting, not an apology. An acknowledgement. Grace's heart thudded once hard. The meeting began, voices droning on about permits and budgets. But she heard none of it. She was acutely aware of every small movement he made. The way he crossed his legs, the way his hand brushed the edge of his notebook but didn't write anything. At one point, a question was raised about funding. The moderator cleared his throat. "We've been fortunate to have interest from private donors," he said, including a local resident who's expressed willingness to support the project. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Grace glanced at the moderator, then back at the man to rows ahead. He did not react, did not smile, did not look around to see who was watching. He simply listened. Something about that unsettled her more than if he'd stood up and claimed the room. When the meeting adjourned, chairs scraped against the floor. People gathered coats and purses. Conversations blooming again. Grace stood, unsure whether to leave quickly or linger. He solved the problem for her. Grace. Her name landed softly, carefully. She turned. Up close, he looked older than he had on the sidewalk. Not frail. Just real. Lines around his eyes that suggested laughter once lived there. Regret too. "I hoped you'd come," he said. "I almost didn't," she replied. This seemed unlikely. A pause. "Yes," he said. "That's one word for it." They stood there, surrounded by people and yet strangely alone. "You never corrected me," Grace said. Not accusing, just stating a fact. He nodded once. "I didn't think I had the right." That wasn't an answer. "No," he agreed quietly. "It wasn't." She studied him, the way she once had when she was younger and braver. "Are you going to tell me I imagined it?" "No." "Are you going to tell me you're someone else entirely?" He hesitated. Long enough for the truth to stretch between them. "I'm going to tell you," he said, "that I haven't used that name in a very long time." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. "Why?" she asked. He looked around the room, then back at her. "Not here." Grace considered him, considered herself. considered the years she'd spent telling herself that the past was settled. "There's a cafe across the street," she said. "If you're going to explain, you can at least do it somewhere with decent coffee." Relief flickered across his face before he could hide it. "I'd like that," he said. As they walked out together side by side, Grace felt something she hadn't felt since before grief had rearranged her life. Not hope, not fear, possibility. And if you're still listening, let me ask you this, because this moment matters. When the past finally stands in front of you, do you walk away to protect your peace, or do you sit down and hear the truth, even if it changes everything? We're just getting started. The cafe was small, warm, and inconveniently intimate. Exposed brick walls, wooden tables polished smooth by years of elbows and conversation. The low hiss of a steaming espresso machine filled the air, blending with soft jizz that seemed determined not to intrude. Grace chose a table near the window. Not the corner, not hidden, neutral ground. He pulled out the chair across from her, hesitated as if unsure whether to sit, and then did. The distance between them was small enough to feel intentional. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The barista approached, cheerful and oblivious. Orders were placed. Coffee arrived. Time moved forward despite the weight of everything that had followed them inside. Grace wrapped her hands around her mug and finally met his eyes. "You don't get to disappear for 40 years and then pretend this is casual," she said calmly. He nodded. No defensiveness. No attempt to soften the truth. "I know." "Then start talking." He looked down at the table, tracing the grain of the wood with his fingertip, as if grounding himself. "I didn't disappear because I stopped caring," he said. "I disappeared because I was afraid of what caring would cost me." Grace leaned back slightly. "That sounds rehearsed." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I've had a long time to think about it. Thinking isn't the same as answering." He exhaled, slow and measured. "When we knew each other," he said, "I was desperate to become someone else. Bigger, untouchable. I thought love was something I'd come back to once I'd proven myself." "And did you?" she asked. He looked up then, really looked at her. "I proved myself," he said. "I just didn't come back." The words settled between them. Grace felt the familiar ache stir old, but not dull. Sharper now because time had stripped away the drama and left only truth. "You left without a goodbye," she said quietly. "I found out from someone else. Do you know what that does to a person?" "Yes," he said. "Because I've spent the rest of my life doing the same thing to myself." She studied him, searching for deflection, for excuses. There were none. Outside, a couple passed by laughing, arms linked. Grace noticed the way his gaze flickered toward them and then back to the table. "You look different," she said. "So do you." She almost smiled. They sipped their coffee. The silence now felt less hostile, still heavy but shared. "Why now?" Grace asked. "Why move here?" He hesitated. "I didn't move here because of you," he said carefully. "But seeing you made me realize I never chose a place by accident." She absorbed that. "You could have pretended not to recognize me," she said. "You still could." "Yes," he agreed. "But I'm tired of pretending." That surprised her. She set her mug down. "What do you want from me?" The question hung in the air, daring him to answer it honestly. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I know I don't want to walk away again." Grace felt her pulse quicken. Not with excitement, but with caution. "I'm not the woman I was," she said. "I don't chase people who leave." "I'm not asking you to," he replied. "I'm asking you to let me sit here and tell you the truth. Whatever you decide after that, I'll respect." She watched him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "All right," she said, "but understand this, some truths close doors. They don't open them." "I know." And for the first time since they'd sat down, he looked afraid. If you're still with us, pause here for a second. Have you ever sat across from someone who once mattered deeply, knowing that one honest conversation could either heal everything or finally end it? Because in the next part, the past won't stay buried. And what Grace learns may change how she sees him forever. He didn't start with the beginning. He started with the part that still hurt. "I changed my name the year I turned 30. He said quietly, "not legally at first, just in practice. New city, new circle, new version of myself." Grace didn't interrupt. "I told myself it was temporary." He continued, "that once I built something solid, I'd come back and explain. But success has a way of rewarding delay. Every door that opened made it easier to leave the old ones closed." Grace folded her hands in her lap. "You make it sound like an accident." "It wasn't," he said. "It was a choice, repeated every day." The cafe had grown quieter around them. Or maybe Grace had simply stopped noticing anything else. "You wrote me a letter," she said suddenly. He looked up, startled. "I did," he said. "I never sent it." "I know," she replied, "because I found it." His breath caught. "You left it in the trunk of your car," she said, "the night you drove away. I went looking for you the next morning. I thought maybe you'd changed your mind." She paused, steadying herself. "I found the letter instead." He closed his eyes briefly as if bracing for impact. "You didn't read it," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I did," Grace said, "every word." He swallowed. "In that letter," she continued, "you told me you loved me. You told me you were afraid you'd ruin us if you stayed. You promised you'd come back when you were ready." Her voice did not shake. "You never came back." "No," he said. "I didn't." Grace leaned back, her gaze fixed on his face. "Do you know what it's like to grieve someone who's still alive?" "Yes," he said immediately. "Because I've been doing it for 40 years. She searched his eyes for self-pity. "Found none. After you left," she said, "I married a good man. A steady man. He never made me doubt where I stood. And I loved him." "I know," he said. "I looked you up once, years ago." That surprised her. "You didn't reach out." "I didn't deserve to," he said. She considered that. "My husband died suddenly," she went on. "No goodbye, no unfinished conversations, just a gone." He nodded slowly, understanding settling into his bones. "I promised myself after that," Grace said, "that I wouldn't reopen old wounds, that I wouldn't chase ghosts." "I'm not asking you to," he said again. She studied him, then reached into her purse. Her fingers closed around something familiar. She placed it on the table between them. A bracelet. Simple. Slightly worn. "You gave me this the summer before you left," she said. "You told me it was so I'd remember you when you made it big." His throat tightened. "I never took it off," she said. "Not even after I married Thomas." He knew what it meant. He said some loves don't disappear, they just go quiet. Silence pressed in. He stared at the bracelet like it was evidence of a life he'd abandoned. "I didn't know how to come back," he said hoarsely, "and after a while, I was afraid you'd hate me if I did." Grace's eyes softened not with forgiveness, but with recognition. "Hate would have been easier," she said. "At least then you'd still have mattered." The words landed hard. He nodded, accepting them. Outside, rain began to fall lightly against the window, blurring the world beyond the glass. 2 lives, 2 decades of separate choices. And one truth finally spoken aloud. "If you're still here with us, let me ask you something honest. Have you ever held on to something from your past not because it hurt, but because it proved what you felt was real?" Because in the next part, something unexpected will happen, something neither of them planned, that will bring them closer than words ever could. The rain fell steadily outside, the soft patter against the window blending with the hum of conversation in the cafe. Yet inside, Grace and he existed in a quiet bubble, removed from time and from the ordinary world that had kept them apart for decades. He finally reached for her hand, not boldly, not presumptively, but with the tentative care of a man afraid of breaking what had just begun to mend. She allowed it, letting the warmth of his palm rest against hers, tentative but grounding. They spoke in small fragments at first. "Do you remember the night we watched the fireworks over the harbor?" he asked softly. Grace smiled faintly, the memory vivid. "I do. You promised me then that you'd always find a way back." He nodded, the weight of his years pressing down on him. "I didn't know how to return then. I was as scared and foolish." She shook her head gently. "We were both foolish in our own ways." Their laughter was quiet, hesitant, but it broke the tension that had gripped them since the sidewalk encounter. For a few moments they were just a people, not a billionaire and a widow, not a man and the ghost of someone he had left behind. They shared memories, gentle teasing, and confessions that had been long suppressed. Each revelation was a thread, pulling them closer together, weaving a fragile tapestry of trust and recognition. "Do you ever regret the life you built?" Grace asked, her voice careful. "Every day," he admitted, voice low. "But not for what I accomplished. For what I almost lost and only now perhaps can find again." A pause hung between them, the kind that carried both hope and fear. Grace studied his eyes, for the first time in decades. She allowed herself to believe that a second chance might not be impossible. "Do you think it's too late?" she asked quietly. He looked at her with sincerity. "I don't know, but I do know that some chances are worth risking everything for." His small smile touched her lips, fragile but real. In that moment, both of them understood that connection was not a certainty. It was fragile, precious, and entirely worth the risk. "Before we continue, let me ask you something for reflection, because Golden Heart Stories isn't just about listening. Have you ever taken a risk on someone or something later in life, not knowing if it would work, but knowing it would matter forever? If this story touches you, consider sharing this moment with someone who believes in second chances." The fragile warmth between them lasted barely a week. It began subtly. A missed phone call, a hurried text left unread, small misunderstandings that escalated into silent walls. Grace had invited him to a gallery opening she curated, something she had poured her heart into over months. She had imagined him there, supportive, interested. Instead, he arrived late, distracted, his attention drawn to someone else, a benefactor he hadn't mentioned. A woman who seemed to demand more of him than she had the right to. Grace felt a sudden coldness she hadn't anticipated. The careful trust they had begun to build felt fragile, almost illusionary. "Who's she?" she asked quietly later, as they stepped out into the crisp evening air. "She's is someone I work with," he said, avoiding her gaze. "She's more than that," Grace said, her voice firmer now. "I saw how she looked at you." "It's complicated," he tried. Grace turned sharply, the years of caution returning like a shield. "Complicated?" she said, voice tight. "You're telling me that after everything, you can't be honest with me?" "I'm trying," he started, but she cut him off. "You're trying. You disappear for decades, then show up, and now I have to guess whether this is real or just another chapter you'll close without a word." The hurt in her voice was sharp, piercing, the kind of raw honesty he hadn't felt in decades. It hit him harder than any boardroom defeat or financial loss ever could. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, but even he knew it was too late. Words alone couldn't undo the sting of uncertainty and fear. She shook her head, fighting tears she refused to let fall. "I can't do this right now. I need it. Space. You can't just come back into my life and expect it all to be fixed." He nodded, his own chest tight. realizing that pride and hesitation had betrayed him yet again. They parted that night under the dim glow of the streetlight, each swallowed by their own thoughts. Inside, Grace's apartment felt impossibly quiet. She stared at the bracelet on her counter, a reminder that some connections can't be severed so easily. He returned to his estate, the walls of his house pressing in, echoing the same emptiness he had felt before. But this time, it was worse. He had been given a chance at something precious, and he had nearly let it slip. And yet, neither of them could truly walk away. If you've ever felt a connection that seems fragile, that teeters between hope and despair, you understand this moment. It's raw, it's frightening, and it's the test of whether love, after decades, can survive honesty, fear, and pride. Before we move forward, I want to ask you, have you ever let fear or pride nearly ruin something that truly mattered? Take a moment and think about it. If this resonates, leave a comment sharing your story. You might just help someone else see they're not alone. Days passed. Neither Grace nor he called. The air between them was filled with unspoken words, the weight of what had almost been, and the fear of what might never be. He sat in his study, hands folded over a letter he had written but hadn't sent, a letter that poured out every regret, every truth, every longing he had kept buried for decades. His eyes scanned the words again and again, and for the first time in years, he felt the tremor of fear, not of failure, but of rejection. Grace, meanwhile, wandered through her quiet home, touching items that reminded her of a life fully lived but never fully hers. The bracelet rested on her wrist. A silent question: can the past and present coexist? Can she allow herself to believe in a love that had survived so long, unseen and heard, yet undeniably present? Finally, he made a decision. He drove across town, each turn carrying him closer to her and further from the fear that had kept him away for 40 years. Grace heard the knock before she opened the door. It was tentative, polite, yet insistent enough to stir her heart. "I can't not come," he said simply. As she opened the door, "I've spent decades avoiding the truth. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to tell you everything, and I want to hear everything too, if you'll let me." She studied him, every line on his face, every shadow of past pain and resilience. She had a choice to. The moment hung between them, silent, heavy, filled with decades of longing and loss. Then Grace stepped aside. "Come in," she said. They sat together, closer now, the distance of fear and pride finally shrinking. He spoke first. Every truth, every regret, every confession spoken with quiet sincerity. Never rushed, never grandiose. She listened, and then she spoke, telling him about the life she had built, the love she had known, the grief she had endured, and the hope that still lingered in her heart. They were raw, they were vulnerable, they were human. And in that quiet intimacy, they discovered that the love they had once known and almost lost was still alive, fragile but undeniable. If you've ever had a chance to choose vulnerability over pride, honesty over avoidance, you understand what it feels like in that split second: terrifying, exhilarating, and transformative. Before we close, consider this: what choice have you been avoiding that could change your life if you finally faced it? Share your thoughts in the comments. You might just inspire someone to take their own leap. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the streets glistening under the warm glow of evening lamps. Grace and he sat together in her living room, the soft hum of the city beyond the windows a gentle counterpoint to the quiet intensity between them. He reached for her hand, this time without hesitation. She didn't flinch. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as if no years, no fear had ever existed between them. "I've spent decades trying to measure what mattered," he said softly, eyes never leaving hers. "And I finally understand. It was you all along, always you." Grace's throat tightened. "I almost didn't let you back in." pride, fear is so many reasons. But seeing you again, hearing the truth, I realized that some connections are too important to ignore. They smiled at each other, small but profound, a quiet victory earned through honesty, patience, and the courage to confront a lifetime of avoidance. He stood walking to the window, gazing at the neighborhood bathed in the soft light of street lamps. I never want to let this go again. No more absences, no more missed chances. Grace rose as well, joining him by the window. Neither do I, she whispered. The bracelet on her wrist gleamed in the lamplight, a symbol of the years gone by and the possibility that now stretched ahead. The past had been acknowledged, the regrets spoken, the losses honored. Outside, the world continued moving, oblivious to the profound reconciliation happening inside a quiet home. For the first time in decades, two hearts beat not just in proximity, but in understanding, fragile, yes, but stronger for every test it had endured. They embraced not out of desperation, but out of recognition. A love that had waited, silently, patiently, had found its way home. Grace leaned her head against his chest. "Do you think it's really possible," she murmured, "to get a second chance at this late in life?" He smiled, pressing his forehead to hers. "I do, if you have the courage to let it in." And with that, the chapter that had begun with hesitation, missed words, and decades of absence closed with triumph, hope, and the undeniable proof that some loves, though delayed, are never truly lost. Outro vertical bar warm channel close minutes 28:30. Thank you for joining us at Golden Heart Stories. This story reminds us that the heart often waits longer than we expect, and when we are ready, it finds a way back home. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share so others can experience the same warmth and hope. And let me ask you one last question. Have you ever been given a second chance at love, friendship, or a dream later in life? Share your experience in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. Until next time, remember, it's never too late for the heart to find its way.